Gurdain pressed her infant daughter closer to her chest, the thin fabric of her soaked cloak doing little to shield Yolanella from the biting wind. The storm had descended without warning, transforming the familiar landscape into a white void where sky and ground became indistinguishable. Her violet-tinted skin had taken on a darker hue from the cold, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she ran toward the distant glow of communal shelter lights. Around her, other figures rushed through the swirling snow, their forms barely visible as they hurried to safety. The metal doors of the public shelter stood ahead, already half closed. Gurdain could see her people pushing inside, cramming into the warmth and safety beyond. She called out, her voice lost in the roar of wind, but she kept running, her bare feet leaving bloody prints in the snow. Yolanella whimpered against her chest, the sound cutting through Gurdain's heart more sharply than any blade. She reached the doors just as they began to seal. Her fist pounded against the cold metal, the impact sending sharp pain up her arm. Through the narrow gap that remained, she could see faces she recognized. Neighbors who had shared meals at her table, friends who had celebrated Yolanella's birth just months ago. But now their eyes were cold, averted, guilty. A voice came through the gap, hollow and distant. It belonged to one of the shelter administrators, a tall male with ceremonial markings she had once respected. His words were simple, final, devastating. "We are at capacity. Return to your sector." The emphasis on "your" carried an unspoken accusation, a reminder that she had been marked as different, as cursed ever since her mate had died in the mining collapse. The community had turned their backs on her then, and they were doing so again now. Gurdain slammed her hand against the door one more time, desperation making her voice crack as she pleaded, "My child! Please, just my child! Take her!" But the gap narrowed, the metal groaning as the locks engaged. Through the last sliver of light, she saw the administrator's face disappear into shadow. Then there was only the cold, unyielding surface of the door and the howling storm. For a moment she stood there shaking, her mind unable to process the abandonment. Then Yolanella cried out, a thin wail that jolted her back to the present. She had to move. She had to find shelter. Gurdain turned away from the closed doors, pulling her cloak tighter around her daughter, and stumbled back into the storm. The wind had grown stronger, each gust threatening to knock her off her feet. Ice formed on her eyelashes, making it difficult to see. She knew this region, had walked these paths hundreds of times, but everything looked alien now, transformed by the white curtain that surrounded her. She moved by instinct, heading toward where she thought the eastern ridge lay, where there might be caves or overhangs that could provide protection. Her legs grew heavy, each step requiring more effort than the last. The cold was seeping into her bones, making her thoughts sluggish. She whispered promises to Yolanella, assurances that they would be safe, that they would find warmth, that everything would be all right. The lies tasted bitter on her frozen lips, but she kept repeating them, as much for herself as for her daughter. The ground betrayed her without warning. One moment she was walking, the next her foot found nothing but air. She had stepped onto a hidden patch of ice that concealed a depression in the terrain. Her body twisted as she fell, instinct making her turn to protect Yolanella from the impact. She hit the ground hard, her shoulder taking most of the blow. The pain was immediate and sharp, but worse was the sensation of her daughter slipping from her arms. Gurdain's scream was torn away by the wind. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, her fingers clawing at the snow. It was deeper here, having accumulated in the natural hollow. She could barely feel her hands anymore, but she dug frantically, her nails breaking against hidden rocks. Blood from her fingertips stained the white surface pink. She heard it then, faint and fading, the cry of her child. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, distorted by the wind. Gurdain lunged in the direction she thought it came from, her movements growing weaker, less coordinated. The cold was winning. She could feel it in the sluggish beat of her heart, in the way her vision was narrowing to a tunnel. Her hand hit something solid, and for one wild moment, she thought she had found Yolanella. But it was just a rock, ice-covered and useless. The crying had stopped. Whether that was because the wind had carried it away, or because her daughter had succumbed to the cold, she did not know. The not knowing was worse than any physical pain. Gurdain tried to call out, but her voice was gone, reduced to a hoarse whisper. Her body was shutting down, her limbs refusing to obey. The last thing she felt before darkness claimed her was the snow against her face, cold and strangely soft, like a final embrace from a world that had already given up on her. On the far side of the same valley, Isidore fought his way through the storm with grim determination. The human miner was built solid and compact, his body conditioned by years of hard labor in harsh environments. His thermal suit was rated for extreme conditions, but even its advanced technology was being tested by this unexpected blizzard. The heads-up display in his helmet showed the outside temperature dropping to lethal levels, far below what the initial forecasts had predicted. His transport had broken down 3 kilometers back, its engine seizing in the cold despite all the safeguards. He had sent out a distress signal before the communication array had frozen over, but he knew help would not arrive until the storm passed. His only option was to reach the mining outpost ahead, a journey that should have taken an hour, but was now stretching into its third. The scanner on his wrist had picked up an unusual energy signature earlier, a brief spike that did not match any known geological phenomenon. Isidore was supposed to investigate such anomalies as part of his job, but right now survival took precedence over scientific curiosity. Still, the reading had been in the direction he was already heading, so he kept the scanner active, hoping it might lead him to some kind of shelter or equipment that could help him weather the storm. The wind screamed around him, carrying ice crystals that rattled against his helmet like bullets. Visibility was essentially zero. He relied on the compass and the terrain mapping system to keep him on course, trusting the technology to guide him when his eyes could not. Each step was a battle against the wind, which seemed determined to push him back or knock him sideways into some unseen danger. Then he heard it. At first he thought it was a trick of the wind, some acoustic quirk that made the storm sound almost like a crying infant. He paused, activating his helmet's audio filters to cut through the ambient noise. There it was again, clearer this time. A cry, high-pitched, distressed, unmistakably the sound of a young creature in pain or fear. Isidore's training told him to keep moving, to not deviate from his path to safety. But his instincts, the deeper human impulses that had nothing to do with logic or protocols, made him stop and listen. He turned slowly, trying to pinpoint the direction. The cry came again, weaker now, from somewhere to his left. Down in a depression he could barely make out through the swirling white. He activated his helmet light, the bright beam cutting through the storm. The light caught on the disturbed snow, showing where something had fallen or been dragged. The crying was fainter now, barely audible even with the audio enhancement. Isidore made his decision in a heartbeat. He turned off the mapped route and headed toward the sound. The depression was deeper than he expected. His boots sank into snow that came up to his knees, and he had to use his hands to help pull himself forward. The crying had stopped, and for a terrible moment he thought he was too late, that he had imagined the whole thing. Then his light caught on a small mound of snow that seemed out of place, too regular in its shape. Isidore dropped to his knees and began digging with his gloved hands. The snow was loose on top but packed hard underneath. He cleared it away in handfuls, his heart pounding, until his fingers touched something that was not snow or rock. Fabric. Wet fabric wrapped around something small. He uncovered her carefully, afraid of causing harm with his urgency. The infant was tiny, impossibly fragile looking, with skin that had a violet tint even through the blue of extreme cold exposure. Her lips were dark, almost black, and when he held his hand near her face, he could barely feel any breath. But she was alive. Barely, but alive. Isidore did not hesitate. He unsealed the front of his thermal suit and pulled the child inside, pressing her against his bare chest where his body heat could do the most good. The shock of her cold skin against his made him gasp, but he held her there, re-zipping the suit to create a sealed environment. His suit's heater was designed for one person, but it would have to do for two. He looked around, his mind racing. This child had not appeared here by magic. Someone had been carrying her, someone who had fallen and lost their grip. He swept his light in wider arcs, looking for any sign of another person. The storm made it difficult to see more than a few meters in any direction, but he had to try. He found tracks, or what remained of them. The wind was already filling them in, but the pattern was clear enough. Someone had been walking, had fallen, had crawled. He followed the trail, moving as quickly as he dared with the infant tucked against him. He could feel her stirring slightly, could feel the faint beat of her heart against his ribs. She was warming, but slowly, too slowly. The trail led him around a small rise and down into another hollow. There, half buried in the snow, lay a figure. Isidore's light revealed violet skin, darker in places where frostbite had set in, and long limbs sprawled in the desperate posture of someone who had fought to the last moment. He could not tell if this person was alive or dead. He knelt beside the figure, brushing snow away from the face. It was a female of the native species, he could tell that much. Her eyes were closed, her lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. He pulled off one glove and pressed his fingers against her neck, searching for a pulse. For long seconds he felt nothing, and his heart sank. Then he felt it, weak and irregular, but there, a pulse. Isidore tried to speak to her, to tell her he was there to help, but she did not respond. Her skin was cold, colder than the child's had been, and he knew she was in severe hypothermic shock. He could not carry both her and the infant safely, not in these conditions, but he could not leave her either. He made a quick assessment. The woman was larger than he was, her alien physiology giving her a height advantage despite her slenderness. But desperation and adrenaline gave him strength. He managed to get her into a sitting position, then hauled her up and over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. It was not dignified, and it would be exhausting, but it would work. With the infant against his chest and the woman draped over his shoulder, Isidore began the hardest journey of his life. Each step was agony, his muscles screaming in protest, his lungs burning as he sucked in the frigid air through his helmet's respirator. The suit's power indicator was dropping faster now, the heater working overtime to compensate for the additional heat loss. He had maybe an hour before the battery died. The outpost was still 20 minutes away in good conditions. In this storm, it might as well have been on another planet. He forced himself to keep moving, one foot in front of the other. Count the steps. Do not think about how far there is to go. Just the next step, and the next. The wind pushed against him, and he leaned into it, using it as a kind of support. The woman on his shoulder was a dead weight, and he had to keep adjusting his grip to prevent her from sliding off. The infant moved against his chest, a small shift that told him she was still alive. He talked to her, a constant stream of words that she could not possibly understand, but which helped him maintain focus. He told her she was safe now, that he would not let anything happen to her, that her mother would be all right. He had no way of knowing if any of that was true, but he said it anyway. Time lost meaning. There was only the storm, the weight, the cold, and the need to keep moving. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else, mechanical things that obeyed through sheer force of will rather than any conscious control. Ice had formed on the outside of his helmet, obscuring his vision, and he had to keep wiping it away with numb fingers. Then, through the white chaos, he saw a shape. Angular, artificial, the outpost. Relief flooded through him, giving him a burst of energy he did not know he still had. He staggered toward it, his feet catching on hidden obstacles, nearly falling twice but somehow staying upright through sheer momentum. The door was frozen shut. Of course it was. Isidore did not have the strength left to pry it open manually, and his hands were too numb to operate the keypad properly. He did the only thing he could think of. He stepped back and kicked the door, putting every ounce of remaining strength into the blow. The ice holding it cracked, and the door swung inward. He stumbled into the outpost, the sudden absence of wind almost making him fall. The emergency heater was running, a small mercy that meant the backup power was still functioning. The inside was cramped, designed for equipment storage rather than habitation, but it was warm and dry and out of the storm. Right now it was paradise. Isidore lowered the woman to the floor as gently as his exhausted muscles allowed, then carefully extracted the infant from his suit. She was warmer than before, her skin having regained some of its color, but she was still dangerously cold and weak. He wrapped her in an emergency thermal blanket from the supply locker, then added another on top of that. From the medical kit, he found a nutrient solution designed for emergency field use. It was formulated for humans, but the basic sugars and electrolytes should be safe for most carbon-based life forms. He warmed a few drops of the solution with his body heat, then carefully dripped them onto the infant's lips. She did not respond at first, and fear gripped him. Then her tongue moved, just slightly, tasting the moisture. He added another drop, then another. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to swallow. Her eyes opened, large and dark and filled with fear. He spoke to her softly, making his voice as gentle as possible. "You are safe now, I promise. You are safe." The infant stared at him with those enormous eyes, processing this strange creature who had pulled her from the snow. Then, to his amazement, her tiny hand reached out and grasped his finger with surprising strength. It was a gesture of trust, or perhaps just instinctive need, but it moved him more than he expected. He turned his attention to the woman. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular. The frostbite on her shoulder looked severe, the skin darkened and hard. He stripped away the wet fabric carefully, trying not to cause more damage. The emergency medical kit had thermal patches designed to treat cold injuries. He warmed one against his own arm first, testing it, then applied it to her shoulder. The patch activated, generating gentle heat and releasing medication into the affected tissue. Her fingers and toes showed signs of frostbite as well. He treated each area methodically, working with the focused efficiency of someone who had seen cold injuries before. In the mines, hypothermia was a constant danger, and every miner learned basic cold weather first aid. He just hoped that what worked for humans would work for her species as well. As he worked, she began to stir. Her eyelids fluttered, and a low moan escaped her lips. The first conscious thought that surfaced in her mind was of her child, the desperate need to know if Jolanella was safe. Her eyes opened, unfocused and confused, scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Then she saw him. A human. The realization came slowly, her cold-addled brain struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. Humans were not enemies exactly, but they were outsiders. Different. The subject of cautious, diplomatic relations, but not true trust. And yet this human was holding her daughter. Her protective instincts flared, and she tried to move, to reach for Jolanella, but her body refused to obey. The best she could manage was to lift her head slightly and extend one shaking hand. Isidore saw her reaching and understood immediately. He brought the infant over, still wrapped in the thermal blankets, and gently placed her next to the woman. Gurdane's arms moved with agonizing slowness, but she managed to pull her daughter close. The tears that came then had nothing to do with the cold. They were hot and fierce and filled with relief so profound it was almost painful. Gurdane lay on the floor of the shelter, every muscle in her body aching, while Isidore moved around the small space with quiet efficiency. She watched him through half-closed eyes, studying this stranger who had saved them. He was shorter than the males of her species, but powerfully built, with a face that was foreign but somehow readable. When he caught her watching, he did not look away or show suspicion. Instead, he gave her a small nod, a gesture that seemed to say everything was under control. He noticed the severe frostbite on her shoulder, where her clothing had torn during the fall. The exposed skin had suffered the worst damage, turning a dangerous dark color that she knew meant serious injury. Isidore approached with a thermal patch, and she flinched instinctively, not from fear of him, but from fear of the pain she expected. He paused, understanding her reaction. Then he did something that surprised her. He held up the patch so she could see it clearly, then pressed it against his own forearm first. She watched as it activated, saw his face remain calm and relaxed. He was showing her it was safe, that it would not hurt. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke of empathy and understanding that transcended their different origins. When he moved to apply the patch to her shoulder, she held still, trusting him. The warmth that spread from the patch was gentle, soothing rather than painful. As he worked, his fingers brushed against hers accidentally, just a brief contact. In that moment of touch, she felt something she had not received from her own people in the shelter. Care, genuine concern for her well-being, not as an obligation or a social nicety, but as a fundamental human response to suffering. She looked up at him, meeting his eyes, and gave a slow nod of gratitude. Words were not necessary. The acknowledgement passed between them in that shared look, and something shifted. The barrier of being strangers, of being different species, began to crack. Morning came with a silence that was almost shocking after the storm's fury. Isidore woke from a brief, uncomfortable sleep to find pale light filtering through the outpost's small window. The wind had died down to occasional gusts, and through the cleared patches in the frost-covered glass, he could see blue sky. He checked on his charges first. The infant, Jolanella, was sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady and her color much improved. Gurdain was awake, sitting up now, her eyes clearer than they had been the night before. She had arranged the blankets around her daughter with maternal precision, creating a warm nest that showed the improvement in her own motor control. Isidore began gathering equipment, his mind already working through the logistics of the journey ahead. He needed to return to the main human base before his team launched a full search and rescue operation, which would waste resources and potentially endanger others. But looking at Gurdain and Jolanella, he realized they had nowhere to go. Their home in the native settlement had clearly failed them, and from what he had witnessed at the shelter doors, they would not be welcome back. He pulled up a map on his portable display and knelt beside Garden, angling it so she could see. Her eyes followed his finger as he traced the route eastward to the human base. Food, he said slowly, miming eating. Medicine. He pointed to his medical kit. Safe. He made a roof shape with his hands, then pointed to the east again. Gurdain understood. She could see in his gestures and his earnest expression that he was offering them sanctuary among his people. The idea was frightening in its strangeness. She knew nothing of human culture, of their ways and customs. But as she looked down at Jolanella, at the daughter who had nearly frozen to death because her own people had turned them away, the choice became clear. She met Isidore's eyes and gave a single, slow nod. Then she reached out and took his offered hand, her violet fingers wrapping around his darker ones. The gesture sealed an unspoken agreement between them. He would protect them, guide them to safety, and she would trust him to do so. They set out within the hour, Isidore carrying most of the supplies in a pack cobbled together from storage containers and strapping. Gurdain carried Jolanella in a sling made from thermal blankets, keeping her daughter close to her body for warmth. Despite her lingering weakness, she insisted on walking under her own power, her pride not allowing her to be carried like an invalid. The journey was slow. The storm had transformed the landscape, creating new drifts and obscuring familiar landmarks. Isidore navigated by compass and the position of the sun, which hung low in the pale blue sky. They stopped frequently for rest, and during these breaks, Isidore shared his ration bars with Gurdain, insisting she eat to maintain her strength. At one such stop, Gurdain surprised him by breaking her portion in half and offering it back to him. He had given her his share, assuming she needed it more, but she refused to take charity without reciprocation. They sat in the snow sharing the food equally, and in that simple act of mutual care, something fundamental changed between them. As the sun began to set, they found a cave carved into a rocky outcrop. It was shallow but dry, and most importantly, it offered protection from the wind that had begun to pick up again. Isidore started a small fire using a chemical igniter from his pack, and they huddled around the warmth gratefully. In the flickering light, Gurdain spoke for the first time since leaving the outpost. She touched her chest and said clearly, "Gurdain." Then she pointed to the sleeping infant. "Jolanella." Isidore smiled, understanding. He tapped his own chest. "Isidore." She tried the name, her mouth forming the unfamiliar sounds. "Isidore." It came out slightly wrong, but close enough. He tried her name in return. "Gurdain." Also imperfect, but she smiled at the attempt. They practiced, going back and forth, laughing quietly at each other's pronunciations. It was the first time either of them had laughed in days, and the sound echoed in the small cave like music. In that moment, under the alien stars visible through the cave mouth, they ceased to be merely survivors thrown together by circumstance. They became companions, bound by shared experience and the beginning of mutual understanding. Words were still limited between them, but meaning flowed through gesture, tone, and the simple presence of another being who cared. Dawn brought new challenges. As they crested a snow-covered ridge, they saw movement ahead. A group of figures was trudging through the snow, and as they drew closer, Isidore recognized them as members of Gurdain's species. From her sudden tension, he understood these were her people. The group stopped, staring in shock at the sight of Gurdain alive, and more shocking still, traveling with a human. There were 6 of them, bundled in heavy furs, their expressions ranging from surprise to something harder to read. One step forward, an older male with intricate markings on his face that suggested status or authority. This was an elder, someone who had been at the shelter, someone who had made the decision to close the doors. The elder began speaking in their language, his tone defensive and justifying. Even without understanding the words, Isidore could read the body language. Excuses, explanations. The elder gestured at Gerdan, then at Yolenella, his face showing what might have been guilt or might have been something else. He said words that made Gerdain's face harden. One word came through clearly, repeated by the elder and picked up by others in the group. Cursed. They were calling the child cursed. Isidore felt anger rising in his chest, hot and sharp. These people had left a mother and infant to die in a storm, and now they stood there trying to justify it. He stepped forward, placing himself deliberately between Gerdain and the group. When he spoke, his voice was hard and cold, carrying the weight of moral authority that needed no translation. You left them to die. He pointed at Gerdain, then at Jolanella, then made a gesture of pushing away, of closing a door. You closed them out in the storm. He pointed at each member of the group in turn. I will not let you take them. I will not let you hurt them. He spread his arms wide, making himself a physical barrier. They are under my protection now. The words were in his language, which most of them likely did not understand fully, but the meaning was crystal clear. The elder began to protest, reaching toward Gerdain with what might have been an attempt at reconciliation, but she turned her back on him. It was a deliberate gesture, laden with cultural significance that the other natives clearly understood. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the group. Gerdain walked past her former community without a single glance back, her steps sure despite the deep snow. She moved to Isidore's side, then slightly ahead, leading the way eastward. It was a statement of choice, of loyalty, of rejection of those who had rejected her. Isidore fell into step beside her, and together they left the group behind, their protests and calls fading into the distance. The human outpost appeared on the horizon like a vision from another world. Gerdain stopped at the edge of the cleared area, staring in wonder at the tall metal structures, the bright lights that seemed to turn night into day, the vehicles and equipment that moved with purposes she could not fathom. It was technology on a scale her people had not achieved, a glimpse into the capabilities of the species that had come to this planet as miners and traders. She stood at the gates, clutching Yolanella so tightly the child made a small noise of protest. Everything was overwhelming, the size, the sounds, the sheer alienness of it all. For a moment, her courage faltered. What was she doing here? How could she possibly fit into this world? Isidore spoke into a communicator device on his wrist, his voice calm and steady. A few moments later, a figure emerged from the main building. It was a woman in a military-style uniform, her face showing surprise as she took in the scene. She approached the gate, her eyes moving from Isidore to Gerdain to the infant, assessing the situation with professional efficiency. The officer spoke to Isidore in their language, asking questions that Gerdain could not understand. Isidore responded with firm certainty, his posture protective. He was advocating for them, she realized, fighting for their admittance. The officer looked at Gerdain directly, and her expression softened as she saw the state of the alien woman and child. She had seen enough cold injuries and exhaustion to recognize them regardless of species. Without any more questions, she nodded and gestured for them to enter. The gates opened and Gerdain stepped into a new world. Warm air from heating vents washed over her as they moved through the entrance corridor. People in various uniforms stopped to stare, but no one blocked their path or raised an alarm. They were curious, certainly, but not hostile. Inside the medical facility, the change was even more pronounced. The room was clean, bright, and filled with equipment whose purpose Gerdain could only guess at. Medical personnel in white coats approached, and she tensed, but they moved slowly, speaking in gentle tones. They were not rough or dismissive. They treated her with professional care, as they would any patient. A nurse, a human female with kind eyes, reached for Yolanella. Gerdain's grip tightened instinctively, but the nurse showed her empty hands first, then mimed examining the baby. Slowly, reluctantly, Gerdain allowed her daughter to be taken. She watched with fierce attention as the nurse checked Yolanella over, taking readings with various instruments. And then, to her amazement, the nurse smiled at the baby, making soft, cooing sounds that transcended language. Jolanella, perhaps sensing the kindness, did not cry. Over the following days, Gerdane's body began to heal. The frostbite damage that had darkened her skin gradually faded as the treatments worked their effects. The cracks in her lips sealed, and the awful numbness in her fingers and toes gave way to normal sensation. She ate food that was strange but nourishing, slept in a bed that was soft and warm, and slowly came to understand that she was truly safe. Jolanella improved even more rapidly, as the young often do. Her laughter returned, a sound that Gerdane had feared she might never hear again. It was a high, melodious trill that filled the sterile medical room with life. The human medical staff clearly loved it. They brought small toys, soft and colorful things that made noises when squeezed. Jolanella would grasp them with delight, and the staff would gather around to watch, their faces bright with shared joy. Isidore visited every day. Sometimes he brought food, warm bread, or fruits that he thought they might like. Sometimes he brought clothing, simple but well-made garments that fit better than the medical gowns. Sometimes he just sat with them, his presence a constant in the strange new world they inhabited. Gerdane began learning the human language out of necessity, but also out of a deep desire to communicate properly with the man who had saved their lives. A language specialist visited daily, teaching her basic words and phrases. She proved to be a quick study, her mind hungry for the tools that would let her express what she felt. One morning she was sitting on a bench outside the medical facility, enjoying the weak sunlight. Jolanella dozed in her arms, peaceful and content. Isidore approached with 2 cups of something that steamed in the cool air. He handed her one, and she accepted it, smelling the bitter but not unpleasant aroma. "You are getting stronger," he observed, settling onto the bench beside her. Gerdane nodded, searching for the words she had practiced. "You gave life again." The sentence was halting and grammatically uncertain, but the meaning was clear. Isidore shook his head, deflecting. "I did what anyone would do." But Gerdane looked at him with those intense eyes, the violet irises catching the light. "No, not anyone. My people did not." She paused, gathering more words. "You gave warmth after ice. No one else did this." Her hand moved to rest briefly over his, a gesture that meant more than words could express. Isidore felt the warmth of her touch and the weight of her gratitude. He opened his mouth to respond, to say something humble and dismissive, but the words would not come. Instead, they sat in companionable silence, drinking the warm beverage and watching the activity of the base around them. The silence was not empty. It was full of understanding, of shared experience, of a connection that was growing deeper than either of them fully realized yet. That night, Gerdane made a decision. After Jolanella had been put to bed in the small crib the medical staff had provided, after the lights had been dimmed for sleep, she rose and made her way through the quiet corridors of the residential section. She found Isidore's assigned quarters and knocked softly on the door. He opened it, surprise evident on his face. She stood in the hallway, wrapped in a simple blanket, and extended her hand toward him. In her palm lay a small object, a charm made of twisted threads and a polished stone. It was rough, clearly handmade and obviously old. It was also, he sensed, precious to her. "You protect us," she said, her words more confident now after days of practice. "This is now yours." She pressed the charm into his hand, her fingers closing his around it. Isidore looked down at the simple object, understanding its significance. It was a piece of her old life, perhaps the only piece she had managed to keep through everything, and she was giving it to him. He wanted to refuse, to tell her she should keep it, but he saw the determination in her eyes and knew that refusing would be an insult to the gift and what it represented. "Thank you," he said quietly, his own fingers tightening around hers for just a moment. "I will keep it safe." Their hands remained together for a heartbeat longer than necessary, a connection that was becoming familiar and comfortable, and something more that neither of them was quite ready to name. When she finally withdrew, heading back to her room, Isidore stood in the doorway watching her go, the charm warm in his palm. The next day brought a summons from the base commander. Isidore stood in the neat office, facing a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She gestured for him to sit, then got straight to the point. The alien woman and her child, she began. They cannot return to their settlement? No, Isidore confirmed. They would not be safe there. The commander nodded, having already guessed as much. Then what do you propose? We cannot keep them in the medical facility indefinitely. They are not prisoners, and they are not patients anymore. They need a more permanent solution. Isidore had been thinking about this since the moment he had pulled Yolanella from the snow. He looked out the window, seeing the small courtyard where Gerdani often walked with the baby. As he watched, she lifted Yolanella up toward the sky, letting the child feel the sun on her face. The sight made his decision simple. They stay with me, he said firmly, turning back to the commander. The commander raised an eyebrow. You are taking responsibility for them. I am. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Very well, I will arrange the necessary paperwork, but understand, this is not a small commitment you are making. I understand, Isidore said, and he did. He understood that he was binding his life to theirs, that he was choosing to protect and care for them, not just in this moment, but for whatever came next. It was perhaps the most important decision he had ever made, and it felt absolutely right. That evening, he found Gerdine in the courtyard. She was alone. Yolanella already asleep in the medical facility under the watchful eye of a nurse who had grown particularly fond of her. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He sat beside her on the bench and presented her with a choice, using the words she could understand supplemented by gestures and drawings on a datapad. She could stay here on the base, under the care and protection of the human government. She would be safe, provided for, but in a structured and institutional way. Or she could come with him. He was planning to leave the mining service, to take his savings and start a different life in a civilian settlement. It would be simpler, quieter, and she would be part of his household, his family. Gerdane did not hesitate. She had spent days watching him, learning to read his character through his actions. She knew he was good, truly good, in a way that transcended species or culture. She knew that with him, she and Yolanella would not just survive, but could build something like a real life. Where you go, we go, she said, the words carefully pronounced. Then, for the first time since he had known her, she smiled fully, her face transforming with genuine happiness. Weeks passed in preparation. Isidore arranged his transfer and located a small cottage on the outskirts of a peaceful human settlement, a place where agriculture rather than mining was the primary industry. It was a single-story building with a garden space and a view of rolling hills. It was perfect. They moved in during the first warm days of spring. Isidore spent days fixing the roof, which had leaked during the winter, and calibrating the heating system to work more efficiently. Gerdane, meanwhile, transformed the inside. She hung wine chimes made from salvaged materials in the doorway. She arranged the furniture in ways that made the space feel welcoming. She planted seeds in the garden that would grow into vegetables her people had traditionally eaten, hoping they would thrive in this soil. One evening, as they sat in the main room watching the sunset through the window, Yolanella surprised them both. She had been holding onto furniture, cruising around the room in that way almost walking infants do. But then she let go. She stood alone, swaying slightly, looking between Gerdane and Isidore with an expression of fierce concentration. Then she took a step, and another. She was walking, and the direction she chose was toward Isidore. His face lit up with joy and amazement. He dropped to his knees and opened his arms, and Yolanella walked right into them, squealing with delight at her own accomplishment. Isidore scooped her up, laughing, holding her high in the air. Yolanella giggled, that beautiful trilling sound, and patted his face with her small hands. Gerdane watched them, her eyes bright with tears of happiness, and she spoke softly. She trusts her steps to you because she knows you will catch her. Isidore looked at Gerdane over Yolanella's head, and the moment stretched between them, heavy with meaning. He was not just the man who had saved them. He was becoming something more, something neither of them had expected, but which felt natural and right. That night, after Yolanella had been put to bed in the cradle Isidore had built with his own hands, Gerdane approached him with something in her hand. It was a bracelet, woven from thin metallic threads and small beads that caught the light. It was delicate and beautiful, clearly made with great care and skill. She took his wrist gently and fastened the bracelet around it, her fingers working the clasp. When it was secure, she held his hand in both of hers and spoke. "My people give this only to family." Her voice was quiet but steady. "You are family." The words hung in the air between them. Isidore looked down at the bracelet, feeling the weight of what she was saying. Not just gratitude, not just friendship. Family. She was claiming him as kin, and by extension, offering herself and Yolanella as his. He met her eyes, those striking violet eyes that had first looked at him with fear and pain, but now held only trust and something deeper. "Stay here forever," he said. It was not quite a question, more like a hope spoken aloud. In response, Gerdane did something she had never allowed herself before. She leaned forward and touched her forehead to his, a gesture that, in her culture, represented complete trust, the joining of minds and spirits, the ultimate expression of intimacy. Her skin was warm against his, and he could feel her breath mingling with his own. They stayed like that for a long moment, two beings from different worlds connected in the most fundamental way. When they finally drew apart, both knew that something irrevocable had happened. They were no longer just survivors sharing space. They were family, bound by choice and by love that had grown in the unlikeliest of circumstances. The seasons turned. Winter gave way to spring, spring to summer, summer to the warm abundance of early autumn. The garden flourished, producing vegetables that they harvested together and prepared in meals that combined her cultural traditions with his. The cottage became a true home, filled with laughter and the everyday sounds of life. Yolanella grew. She became faster on her feet, more confident, more curious about the world around her. She learned words in both languages, mixing them freely in the way of children who grow up bilingual. She called Gerdane Mama in the human tongue, the word coming naturally to her lips. One day, while Isidore was working in the garden, pulling weeds and checking the plants, Yolanella toddled over to him. She had a flower clutched in one hand, a small blue wildflower she had picked from near the fence. She held it up to him, offering it with the solemnity of a great gift. He accepted it, making a show of smelling its fragrance and admiring its color. "Beautiful," he told her. "Just like you." She giggled, then did something that made his heart stop. She looked up at him with those large eyes, so much like her mother's, and said clearly, "Dada." Isidore froze. The single word spoken in her high child's voice carried more weight than he could have imagined. He looked toward the cottage where Gerdane stood in the doorway, having heard. She was smiling, her hand over her heart, tears streaming down her face. He lifted Yolanella into his arms, holding her close, and she wrapped her small arms around his neck in a hug. "Data," she said again, pleased with herself for mastering this important word. Gerdane walked over to them, and Isidore extended one arm to include her in the embrace. The three of them stood there in the garden, the sun warm on their backs, surrounded by growing things and the promise of harvest to come. "I do not think about where we come from anymore," Gerdane said, her voice thick with emotion. "We are family. That is what matters." Isidore nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He had been a solitary man, a miner who had expected to live and die alone on this alien world. But a storm had brought him two souls who needed saving, and in saving them, he had saved himself. He had found purpose, connection, and a love that transcended the boundaries of species and origin. As the evening sky darkened and the first stars began to appear, the three of them went inside together. Isidore carried Yolanella, who was already getting sleepy, her head resting on his shoulder. Gerdane walked beside them, her hand resting on his arm. They moved with the easy coordination of a family that had learned each other's rhythms, that fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had always been meant to connect. Inside, they settled into their evening routine. Isidore started the fire in the hearth while Gerdane prepared a simple meal. Yolanella played on the floor with her toys, occasionally looking up to make sure both her parents were still there. The cottage was filled with warmth and light and the intangible but unmistakable feeling of home. Later, after Yolanella had been bathed and read to and tucked into her bed, Isidore and Gerdane sat together on the small couch facing the fire. They did not need to speak. The silence between them was comfortable, full of shared understanding. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain, but inside they were safe and warm. Gurdain thought back to that night in the storm, when she had been certain she would die, when she had lost her daughter in the snow and believed she had lost everything. She remembered the cold, the darkness, the despair. And then she remembered the light of Isidore's helmet, the warmth of his suit, the strength of his arms carrying her to safety. He had appeared from the storm like a miracle, like an answer to prayers she had not even known how to pray. Now, sitting beside him in the home they had built together, she understood that she had not just been saved that night. She had been given a second chance at life, a chance to build something beautiful from the ruins of loss. And she had taken that chance with both hands. Isidore looked at the woman beside him, this remarkable being who had endured so much and emerged with her strength and dignity intact. He had admired her from the first moment he had seen her fighting to survive for her child. That admiration had grown into respect, then friendship, then something deeper that he was only now beginning to fully acknowledge. She was his partner, his family, the center of a life he had never imagined for himself, but which now seemed like the only life worth living. The fire crackled, sending up sparks that danced in the updraft. Outside, the rain began to fall, a gentle patter on the roof that Isidore had repaired so carefully. Inside, two beings from different worlds sat close together, watching the flames and thinking about the strange and wonderful path that had brought them to this moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be neighbors to meet, cultural bridges to build, and the endless small difficulties of raising a child who belonged to two worlds. But those were tomorrow's concerns. Tonight there was only this: warmth, safety, family, and the quiet joy of being exactly where they were meant to be. As the fire burned low and the night deepened around them, Isidore and Gurdain remained side by side. Two survivors who had found in each other not just salvation, but something far more precious. They had found home. The peace lasted 3 months. 3 months of quiet mornings, shared meals, and the simple rhythms of domestic life. Then the visitors came. It was early morning when Isidore heard the commotion outside. He was preparing breakfast, stirring a pot of grain porridge, when raised voices carried through the window. Human voices, angry and numerous. He set down the spoon and moved to the door, his body tensing with instinct honed from years of dealing with rough mining crews. Outside, a group of about 15 settlers had gathered near the property line. They were farmers mostly, rough-handed people who worked the land around the settlement. Isidore recognized several faces, neighbors he had nodded to in passing at the market but never truly spoken with. Their expressions now were hard, suspicious, hostile. A man stepped forward from the group. He was broad-shouldered and thick-necked, his face weathered by sun and wind. His name was Derek, Isidore remembered, one of the larger landholders in the area. He pointed at the cottage with a meaty finger. "We need to talk about your situation here," Derek said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Isidore stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him to keep the confrontation away from Gerdane and Yolanella. "What situation would that be?" "The alien," another man called out. "You are harboring one of them, and a child." "They live here," Isidore said evenly. "This is their home." Derek shook his head. "That is the problem. We do not want them here. Their kind caused problems in the northern settlements. Theft, violence. We heard stories." Isidore felt anger rising, but kept his voice calm. "Gurdain has caused no problems. Neither has her daughter. They keep to themselves, harm no one." "Yet," a woman in the crowd added, "they harm no one yet. But what happens when more of them come? What happens when they decide they want our land, our resources?" "She has nowhere else to go," Isidore said. "Her own people rejected her." "Not our problem," Derek said bluntly. "We came here to build a human community, not a charity shelter for aliens. We want them gone. You have 1 week to make them leave, or we will take action ourselves." The threat hung in the air, ugly and clear. Isidore descended the porch steps slowly, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard. He stopped a few paces from Derek, close enough that the bigger man had to look slightly down to meet his gaze. "They are not going anywhere," Isidore said quietly. "This is their home. If you have a problem with that, you have a problem with me." Derek's face reddened. "You think you can stand against all of us? You are one man. One man who has dealt with worse than a mob of farmers," Isidore replied. I worked the deep mines for 12 years. I have seen cave-ins, equipment failures, and men dying in the dark. You do not scare me, and you will not touch my family." The word family caused murmurs in the crowd. Derek looked like he wanted to push the issue further, but something in Isidore's stance, in the cold certainty of his voice, made him hesitate. He spat on the ground instead. "1 week," he repeated. "Think about what you are choosing." The group dispersed slowly, shooting dark looks back at the cottage. Isidore waited until they were gone before returning inside. Gerdane stood in the main room, Yolanella clutched in her arms. She had heard everything through the window. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a familiar fear. It was the same fear he had seen that night in the storm, the fear of being unwanted, rejected, cast out. "They hate us," she said simply. "They fear what they do not understand," Isidore corrected. He crossed to her and put a hand on her shoulder. "But they will not harm you. I will not let them. You cannot fight them all. I do not need to fight them all. I just need to make it clear that attacking you comes with a cost they are not willing to pay." He paused, thinking, "But we should prepare, just in case." Over the next days, Isidore took precautions. He reinforced the cottage door with additional bars. He sharpened the tools in the shed, setting aside a hand axe and a long knife within easy reach. From his old mining equipment, he retrieved a crossbow he had used for signaling and practice shooting. It was a simple weapon, mechanical rather than technological, but effective. He practiced with it in the evening, sending bolts into a target he set up behind the cottage. Gerdane watched him prepare with growing anxiety. She saw him checking sight lines, planning defensive positions, moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone preparing for violence. It frightened her not because she doubted him, but because she understood what it meant. Their peace was over. The world had found them again, and it was hostile. On the fourth night, Yolanella woke screaming. Gerdane rushed to her daughter's side, finding her sitting up in the small bed, tears streaming down her face. The child was pointing at the window, babbling in distress. Gerdane looked but saw nothing except darkness and the reflection of the room's lamp. Then she heard it, a low rumbling growl from outside. Not human, not any sound she recognized from the native wildlife she had learned about. This was deeper, more primal, the sound of a predator. Isidore appeared in the doorway, the hand axe already in his grip. "Stay here," he commanded. "Bar the door after me." He moved to the front entrance, listened for a moment, then slipped outside into the night. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see by once his eyes adjusted. The growling was coming from near the animal pen, where they kept 2 goats for milk. Isidore moved carefully, his boots silent on the packed earth. As he rounded the corner of the cottage, he saw it. The creature was massive, easily twice the size of an earth wolf. Its fur had a bluish tint in the moonlight, and its eyes reflected green when it turned to look at him. Saliva dripped from jaws filled with teeth designed for rending meat. It had killed one of the goats already, its muzzle dark with blood. When it saw Isidore, it did not run. Instead, it lowered its head and growled again, a sound that vibrated in his chest. Isidore knew this species from miners' warnings. Ridge hunters, they were called. Apex predators that normally stayed in the high country, but sometimes ventured down when food was scarce. They were intelligent, territorial, and extremely dangerous. A single one could kill a grown man if it caught him off guard. The creature took a step toward him, testing. Isidore raised the axe, making himself look larger, more threatening. "Get back," he said firmly, using the tone he would use on a hostile animal. The creature paused but did not retreat. It was calculating, weighing whether this human was prey or competition. Then it charged. The decision was instant, the attack explosive. The beast covered the distance in 3 powerful bounds, its jaws opening wide. Isidore had a split second to react. He dove to the side, rolling across the ground and coming up in a crouch. The creature's momentum carried it past him, and it had to scramble to turn its bulk around. Isidore used those precious seconds to position himself with his back to the cottage wall, eliminating the chance of being attacked from behind. When the creature came again, it was more cautious, circling, looking for an opening. Isidore kept the axe between them, the blade catching moonlight. The beast feinted left, then lunged right. Its teeth snapped shut inches from Isidore's leg as he jerked back. He swung the axe in a downward arc, aiming for the creature's skull, but it was too fast. The blade bit into its shoulder instead, drawing blood and eliciting a yelp of pain and rage. Injured, the creature became more desperate and more dangerous. It attacked again immediately, not giving Isidore time to reset his stance. Claws raked across his forearm, shredding fabric and skin. Pain flared hot and sharp, but he kept his grip on the axe. He brought the weapon up in an undercut, catching the beast under its jaw. The impact was solid, and the creature stumbled back, shaking its head. Blood ran down Isidore's arm, but he ignored it. He advanced on the wounded animal, pressing his advantage. The ridge hunter backed away, reassessing. It had expected easy prey and found a fighter instead. Isidore could see the calculation in its eyes, the decision being made. And then with a final snarl of frustration, it turned and loped away into the darkness, leaving a trail of blood drops behind. Isidore stood there, breathing hard, the axe still raised. He waited, counting to 100 in his head, making sure the creature was truly gone. Only then did he lower his weapon and examine his arm. The cuts were not deep, but they would need cleaning and bandaging. The cottage door opened and Gurdain rushed out. She had watched the entire fight through the window, her heart in her throat, unable to help but unable to look away. She went to him immediately, her hands hovering over his injured arm, her expression anguished. "You are hurt," she said, her voice shaking. "It is not serious," he assured her, though the pain was considerable. "Come inside. I need to clean this before it festers." In the cottage, Gurdain worked with focused intensity, washing the cuts with clean water and applying antiseptic from their medical supplies. Her hands were gentle but thorough. Jolanella watched from her bed, quiet now, her large eyes taking in everything. When Gurdain had finished bandaging the wound, she did not let go of his arm. Instead, she held it carefully, as if it were something precious and fragile. "You could have died," she whispered. "I did not," he said simply, "and neither did you or Jolanella. That is what matters. The humans in town want us gone. Now the wild things come for us. Perhaps," she hesitated, the words clearly painful, "perhaps it would be safer for you if we left." Isidore caught her chin gently, making her meet his eyes. "We have had this conversation already. You are not leaving. We face these things together, whatever comes." The next morning revealed the full extent of the attack. The one goat was dead, torn apart by the ridge hunter. The other was missing, likely having escaped in the chaos. Blood stained the ground near the pen, both from the goat and from the trail the injured creature had left. Isidore spent the morning repairing the damaged fence and burying the dead animal. While he worked, a figure appeared on the path leading to the cottage. Isidore's hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, but he relaxed slightly when he recognized the visitor. It was Felix, an older man who ran the general store in town. Unlike Derek and his group, Felix had always been civil, even friendly, during Isidore's visits. Felix raised both hands in a gesture of peace as he approached. "I come in friendship," he called out. "May I speak with you?" Isidore nodded, setting down his shovel. "What brings you here?" Felix glanced at the blood-stained ground and the damaged pen, his expression troubled. "I heard about the ridge hunter. Dangerous business. You were fortunate." "Fortune had less to do with it than preparation," Isidore said. "But yes, we survived." "I also heard about Derek and his mob," Felix continued. "That is actually why I am here. I wanted you to know that not all of us share his views. There are those in the settlement who believe everyone deserves a chance at peace, regardless of where they came from. How many of you feel that way?" Felix grimaced. "Not enough, I am afraid. Maybe a third of the community. But we are the ones who control the essential services. The store, the medical clinic, the water processing. That gives us some influence. Are you offering an alliance?" "I am offering a warning and some advice," Felix said carefully. "Derek is not going to let this go. He sees you as a threat to his vision of what this settlement should be. He has been gathering support, playing on people's fears. In a few days, he will have enough backing to make another move, a bigger one." "Let him come," Isidore said grimly. "That is your pride talking, not your wisdom," Felix replied. "You are one man with two dependents, one of them a small child. Derek can bring 20 armed farmers. You cannot win that fight. Then what do you suggest?" Felix was quiet for a moment, thinking. Make a show of strength. Prove that Gurdain is not a threat but an asset. Do something that benefits the community, something visible that people cannot ignore. It is harder to demonize someone who has helped you. Isidore considered this. It made sense, though it galled him to have to prove Gurdain's worth to people who had already judged her without knowing her. But if it avoided bloodshed, it was worth attempting. That afternoon, Isidore and Gurdain made the journey into town together, with Yolanella riding on Gurdain's back in a carrier. The settlement was small, just a few dozen buildings clustered around a central square. As they walked through, conversation stopped. People stared, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed hostility. Children pointed until their parents shushed them. Felix was waiting at his store. He had set out various goods that needed sorting, organizing, and pricing. I could use help with inventory, he said loudly, making sure his voice carried to the gathering onlookers. If you are willing to work, I am willing to pay. Isidore understood the performance for what it was, but he played along. They worked through the afternoon, Gurdain proving remarkably efficient at organizing and categorizing supplies. Her memory was exceptional, and her attention to detail surpassed what most humans could manage. More than once, Felix made sure to comment loudly on how helpful she was being. As the sun began to set, a commotion arose near the settlement's well. Voices raised in alarm, and people began running toward the sound. Isidore and Gurdain followed, finding a crowd gathered around the well shaft. A woman was crying, pointing down into the darkness. My boy, she was saying frantically. Alwyn fell in. He went to fetch water and the rope broke. He is down there, and I can hear him crying, but I cannot reach him. The well was deep, at least 20 meters, and narrow. Too narrow for most adults to navigate safely. The men of the settlement were already attempting to rig a rope and harness system, but it was clear they were struggling with the logistics. The child's cries echoed up from the depths, weak and frightened. Gurdain stepped forward without hesitation. She was slender, her build naturally lean. She could fit where others could not. She spoke to Felix, using the words she had learned. I can go down. I am small. Derek was there, and he immediately objected. We are not trusting an alien to rescue a human child. Who knows what she would do down there? The child's mother, desperate and terrified, looked at Gurdain with pleading eyes. Please, she begged, please save my son. Gurdain met Derek's hostile gaze unflinchingly. Then she turned to Isidore. He understood what she was asking. He checked the rope they had prepared, testing its strength, then tied it around her waist in a secure harness knot. Before she descended, he pressed a small knife into her hand for cutting the rope if needed, and squeezed her shoulder once. Be careful, he said. She nodded and began her descent into the well. The shaft was tight, the stone walls slick with moisture. She had to brace herself with her hands and feet, moving inch by careful inch. The darkness swallowed her quickly, broken only by the faint light from above. Water sounds echoed around her, disorienting and eerie. The child's crying grew louder as she descended. He was alive at least. That was something. When she finally reached the bottom, her feet touched cold water that came up to her ankles. In the dim light filtering from above, she could see the boy, perhaps 6 years old, huddled on a narrow ledge that kept him above the waterline. His leg was bent at an angle that made her wince. Broken, certainly. Hello, she said softly, using one of the first words she had learned. The child looked at her with wide, terrified eyes, seeing her alien features in the gloom. She moved slowly, making herself as non-threatening as possible. She touched her chest. Gurdain, I help. The boy Alwyn was too scared and in too much pain to protest. When she reached for him, he did not pull away. She examined his leg as gently as possible. The break was bad, but not compound. She would have to be extremely careful. Using the rope that was still attached to her waist, she created a makeshift harness for the child, securing him to her front so both her hands would be free for climbing. The boy whimpered in pain as she moved him, but he trusted her, clinging to her with small, desperate hands. The ascent was infinitely harder than the descent. She had to support the child's weight while climbing, her muscles screaming with effort. Halfway up, her foot slipped on the wet stone, and for a heart-stopping moment, they swung freely on the rope. Alwyn cried out, and so did his mother above. But Gerdine found her footing again, her determination overriding her fear. When she finally emerged from the well shaft, hands reached to take the child from her. The mother was sobbing with relief, cradling her injured son. The settlement's doctor, a woman named Emma, immediately began examining Alwyn's leg, declaring that it was broken but would heal. Gerdane collapsed on the ground, exhausted and shaking from the adrenaline. Isidore was there instantly, helping her to her feet, checking her for injuries. She was bruised and scraped, but whole. She looked at the crowd that had gathered, seeing their expressions shift from hostility to uncertainty to something else. Respect, perhaps, or at least the beginning of it. The child's mother approached, still crying, and did something unexpected. She took Gerdane's hand and pressed it to her forehead, a human gesture of deep gratitude. "Thank you," she said brokenly. "Thank you for saving my boy." Gerdane nodded, too tired to speak. She had proven herself, she knew. But whether it would be enough to change the settlement's mind remained to be seen. That night, lying in bed with Jolanella asleep between them, Gerdane asked Isidore a question that had been weighing on her. "Why do they fear us so much? What did my people do to humans to make them hate us?" Isidore was quiet for a long moment, his arm draped protectively over both her and Jolanella. "It is not hate," he said finally. "Not really. It is fear of the unknown, fear of change. Humans came to this world looking for resources and a fresh start. They were not expecting to find sentient life already here. That complicated things, made them feel like invaders, or like they had to compete for space and survival. And when people are afraid, they lash out at what is different. My people do the same," Gerdane admitted quietly. "They feared me after my mate died. Called Jolanella cursed. Fear makes people cruel." "Yes," Isidore agreed, "but it also makes them capable of courage. That woman today, Alwyn's mother, she was afraid, but her love for her child was stronger than her fear of you. That is how we change things. One person at a time, one brave choice at a time." 2 days later, Felix brought news. Derek's coalition was fracturing. The rescue of Alwyn had swayed many who had been on the fence. Seeing Gerdane risk her life for a human child had made it impossible to maintain the fiction that she was a threat. There were still holdouts, still those who viewed her presence with suspicion and resentment, but they no longer had the numbers to force the issue. "You have bought yourself some peace," Felix told them when he visited the cottage. "How long it lasts depends on what happens next. Keep your heads down, continue being good neighbors, and eventually people will forget to be afraid." That evening, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Gerdane felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with sadness. They had won this battle, but she knew there would be others. The world would always find reasons to push them apart, to question their right to exist as a family. But as she felt Isidore's warmth beside her and heard Jolanella's soft breathing as the child played at their feet, she also felt something else: determination. They had found each other against impossible odds, had built something beautiful in a hostile world. She would not let fear tear that down. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Weeks turned into months, and the seasons changed again. Winter approached with its promise of cold and hardship, but the cottage was ready. Isidore had insulated the walls, stocked firewood, and preserved vegetables from the garden. Gerdane had woven warm blankets and made clothing that would protect them all from the coming freeze. The settlement, slowly and grudgingly, began to accept their presence. Some people remained hostile, crossing to the other side of the street when they saw Gerdane in town, but others nodded in greeting. A few even smiled. The rescue of Alwyn had created a crack in the wall of prejudice, and time was gradually widening that crack. Jolanella continued to grow, her personality blossoming. She was fearless and curious, asking endless questions in her mixture of languages. She played with the few human children whose parents were open-minded enough to allow it, and in their innocent acceptance, there was hope for a different kind of future. One morning, Isidore woke to find Gerdane already up, standing by the window. She had a distant look in her eyes, the kind she got when she was thinking about her old life. He joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. "My people," she said. "I wonder if they survived the winter, if they remember me at all, or if I am just a cautionary tale they tell their children. Do you regret leaving them?" She turned to look at him, her violet eyes clear and certain. No, they made their choice, and I made mine. I just wonder sometimes if there were others like me. Other cursed ones, other outcasts. I wonder if they survived. 3 days later, she got her answer. A knock came at the door just after dawn, urgent and insistent. Isidore opened it to find a young woman standing there, her skin bearing the characteristic violet tint of Gurdane's species. She was thin, almost skeletal, and her eyes held the kind of desperation Isidore recognized from the night he had found Gurdane in the storm. The woman spoke rapidly in her native language, gesturing back toward the hills. Gurdane appeared, hearing the familiar sounds of her mother tongue, and stepped forward. The two women spoke quickly, urgently. Isidore could not understand the words, but he could read the body language. Something was very wrong. Gurdane turned to him, her face pale. There are more, she said. 12 of them, outcasts like me. They heard stories of an alien woman living with humans, living freely. They came looking for sanctuary, but the settlement turned them away. They are hiding in the caves east of here. They have no food, no shelter. Winter will kill them. Isidore's mind raced, calculating resources, risks, logistics. 12 refugees. That was a lot of mouths to feed, a lot of bodies to shelter. And bringing them here would reignite all the tensions with Derek and his faction. It could undo everything they had carefully built. But even as those practical concerns crossed his mind, he knew what his answer would be. He had been saved from loneliness by taking in 2 refugees. How could he turn away others in the same desperate situation? Bring them here, he said firmly. We will figure it out. Gurdane looked at him with such profound love and gratitude that it nearly took his breath away. She touched her forehead to his in that gesture of deep connection, then began giving rapid instructions to the young woman, who nodded and ran back toward the hills. By afternoon, they began arriving. 12 aliens, most of them women and children, but a few men as well. All bore the marks of hardship, hunger, cold, rejection. They moved with the wary caution of hunted creatures, their eyes darting around, expecting attack at any moment. Isidore and Gerdane fed them first, sharing what food they had. The refugees ate slowly, as if afraid the meal might be taken away. Jolanella, too young to understand the complexity of the situation, moved among them freely, her innocent friendliness gradually easing some of the tension. One of the men, taller than the others with intricate markings on his arms, approached Isidore. He spoke in broken human language, clearly laboriously learned. You help us. Why? We are nothing to you. You are people in need, Isidore said simply. That is reason enough. The man studied him for a long moment, then performed a gesture Isidore had seen before, a clenched fist brought to the heart. It was a sign of respect, of acknowledging honor. Isidore returned it instinctively. That night, the cottage and its surrounding structures were filled to capacity. People slept wherever there was space, wrapped in whatever blankets could be spared. Isidore and Gerdane sat outside, watching over their unexpected charges, knowing that morning would bring new challenges. They will come, Gerdane said quietly. The settlement. When they see what we have done, they will come. I know, Isidore replied, and we will be ready. He was right. The next day, Derek arrived with his coalition, now swelled to nearly 30 people. They stood at the property line, armed with farming tools and makeshift weapons, their faces set with determination and anger. This ends now, Derek shouted. You have brought more of them here. You have turned this into an alien camp. We will not have this. Send them away, or we will drive them out by force. The refugees cowered inside the cottage and outbuildings, terrified. They had fled violence before and knew what was coming. But Isidore stepped forward, and beside him stepped Gerdane. And then, one by one, the other aliens emerged, not to run, not to hide, but to stand. They formed a line, unarmed but unbroken, shoulder to shoulder. And to Isidore's surprise, he was not alone on the human side either. Felix stepped out from Derek's group and crossed to stand with them. Emma, the doctor who had treated Alwyn, followed. Then Alwyn's mother, her son still limping but healing, took her place in the line. Others came, those whose humanity outweighed their fear, until there were perhaps 10 humans standing between the refugees and the mob. They deserve the same chance we had, Felix called out to Derek and the others. We came to this world as settlers, as immigrants. Are we now going to deny others the same opportunity we sought? They are not like us, someone in the mob shouted back. No, Gurdain spoke up, her voice carrying across the space. We are not like you, but we bleed. We love, we fear, we hope. We are alive, and we want only what you want. A place to belong, a chance to survive. Is that so wrong? The mob wavered, uncertainty rippling through their ranks. Derek tried to rally them, but his voice lacked conviction now. The line of defenders, human and alien standing together, was too powerful an image to overcome with simple hatred. Slowly, reluctantly, the mob began to disperse. Some left angry, muttering threats. Others left thoughtful, troubled. A few even approached the line of defenders, curiosity overcoming fear, wanting to speak to the aliens, to understand them. Derek remained longest, his face red with frustrated rage. But eventually even he turned away, knowing he had lost this battle. As he left, he made a final pronouncement. This is not over. Isidore knew he was right. It was not over. The struggle for acceptance, for belonging, for the right to exist as a blended family and community would continue. There would be more challenges, more threats, more moments when everything they had built hung in the balance. But as he looked at the line of people, human and alien, standing together in defiance of fear and hatred, he also felt hope. Real, tangible hope for a future where difference was not something to fear, but something to celebrate. Gurdain took his hand, squeezing it tightly. Jolanella ran to them, embracing both her parents at once. And around them, the refugees began to relax, to smile, to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had found a place where they could belong. The sun set on that day of confrontation, painting the sky in brilliant colors that transcended the boundaries of species or origin. And in that moment, standing together, they were not aliens or humans. They were simply beings trying to build something better than the fear and division that had defined their past. They were family in all its messy, complicated, beautiful forms. And that, Isidore thought as he held his loved ones close, was worth fighting for with everything he had. Winter arrived with a vengeance 2 weeks later. The temperature dropped so sharply that water left outside froze solid within minutes. Snow fell in thick blankets, piling against the walls of the cottage and outbuildings where the refugees had made temporary shelter. Food became the primary concern. 12 additional mouths meant their carefully rationed supplies were depleting faster than Isidore had anticipated. He made the decision to hunt. The forests to the north were known to have herds of large herbivores, creatures with thick fur and meat that could feed them for weeks if properly preserved. He gathered his crossbow, a long knife, and a spear he had fashioned from a straight branch and a sharpened metal blade. One of the refugee men, the tall one with the markings named Alwyn, insisted on accompanying him. The irony of the shared name with the human boy was not lost on anyone. They set out before dawn, moving through snow that came up to their knees. The alien Alwyn proved to be an excellent tracker, reading signs in the disturbed snow that Isidore would have missed. Broken branches here, droppings there, the faint path where animals had moved during the night. They followed the trail deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thick enough to block some of the snow. The herd appeared suddenly, a group of 6 massive beasts with shaggy blue-tinted fur and curved horns. They were grazing on the bark of trees, stripping it with specialized teeth. Isidore and Alwyn crouched behind a fallen log, studying their prey. Taking one would be dangerous. These animals were large and powerful, capable of goring a man with those horns or trampling him under their weight. Isidore signaled his intent, pointing to a younger animal on the edge of the herd. It was still large but less experienced, more vulnerable. Alwyn nodded understanding. They had worked out a basic strategy using gestures and broken words during the walk. Alwyn would circle around to drive the animal toward Isidore, who would wait with the crossbow. The plan went smoothly at first. Alwyn moved with surprising stealth for his size, getting into position without alerting the herd. Then he stood suddenly, waving his arms and shouting. The animals startled, bellowing in alarm. The young one broke away from the group, running in panic directly toward where Isidore waited. He rose from cover, the crossbow already aimed. He had one shot before the animal would be too close or veer away. He exhaled slowly, steadying his aim, then squeezed the trigger. The bolt flew true, striking the animal in the chest behind its front leg. The creature stumbled, its momentum carrying it forward another few paces before it collapsed. But the sound of its death bellow brought unexpected danger. The herd's alpha, a massive male with scarred flanks and horns as thick as Isidore's forearms, charged toward them. It had not seen the humans yet, but was responding to the distress of the younger animal. When it spotted Isidore standing over the kill, it redirected its charge without hesitation. Isidore had no time to reload the crossbow. He dropped it and grabbed the spear, planting the butt in the ground and angling the point toward the charging beast. It was a desperate gambit. If the angle was wrong or his footing slipped, those horns would tear him apart. The beast hit the spear with all its momentum. The impact threw Isidore backward, but the blade bit deep into the animal's chest. The creature's own weight drove the weapon further in. It thrashed and bellowed, trying to shake free, and Isidore rolled away before a flying hoof could crush his skull. Alwyn appeared, wielding a thick branch like a club. He struck the wounded animal across the head repeatedly until it finally collapsed, blood steaming in the cold air. The two hunters stood there, breathing hard, staring at the dead alpha. They had meant to take one animal and had ended up with two. The butchering took hours. They worked with knives, cutting away meat and hide, preserving as much as they could carry. Alwyn showed Isidore techniques his people used, ways of separating muscle groups cleanly and harvesting organs that had nutritional value. By the time they finished, both men were covered in blood, their hands numb from cold and work. They made travois from branches and hide, loading as much meat as they could transport. The journey back was exhausting, dragging the heavy loads through the snow. They stopped several times to rest, sharing dried meat from Isidore's pack and drinking snow melted in their mouths. As they walked, Alwyn spoke in his halting human language. "You fight like one of us. No fear, just action." Isidore shook his head. "I was terrified. Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you alive. But you did not run. Running is not always the answer." They reached the cottage after dark to find Gurdain waiting anxiously by the door. When she saw them, bloodied but whole, relief flooded her face. The other refugees emerged, exclaiming over the massive amount of meat they had brought. That night they cooked and ate and celebrated, the cottage filled with warmth and the smell of roasting meat. But celebration turned to alarm when a child's scream cut through the night. One of the refugee children, a girl named Frida, had wandered outside to relieve herself and encountered something in the darkness. Isidore grabbed his knife and rushed out to find the girl backed against the cottage wall, pointing at the tree line with a shaking hand. Eyes reflected in the darkness. Multiple pairs. The ridge hunters had returned, and they had brought their pack. 5 of them circled at the edge of the clearing, drawn by the smell of fresh blood and cooking meat. The injured one from before was among them, identifiable by its healed shoulder wound. It wanted revenge. Isidore shouted for everyone to get inside, but he knew the thin walls would not stop these predators if they decided to attack in force. He needed to make a stand here, show them that this territory was defended. Alwyn appeared beside him, carrying the spear still slick with the blood of the herd animal. Felix emerged from where he had been visiting, wielding a pitchfork. The 3 men formed a line between the cottage and the predators. The ridge hunters growled, a sound that vibrated in the chest. They were testing, looking for weakness. The injured one paced back and forth, agitated, ready to attack. It lunged first, targeting Isidore directly. He sidestepped and slashed with his knife, opening a line across its ribs. The creature yelped and spun, snapping at him. Felix drove his pitchfork at another that tried to flank them, forcing it back. Alwyn wielded the spear with skill, keeping 2 more at bay with quick jabs. The fight was chaotic, desperate. The creatures were fast and coordinated, working as a pack to find openings. One managed to get past their line and charged toward the cottage door. Gurdain appeared in the doorway, holding the hand axe. When the beast leaped at her, she swung with all her strength, catching it across the snout. The creature fell back, blood pouring from the wound, and retreated howling into the darkness. The pack leader, seeing its members injured and driven back, made a final decision. It called out with a strange barking howl, and the other ridge hunters began to disengage. The injured one backed away last, fixing Isidore with a stare that promised this was not finished. Then they were gone, melting into the forest. Isidore checked everyone for injuries. Felix had a nasty gash on his arm where claws had caught him. Gerdane's hands were shaking from adrenaline, but she was unhurt. The refugees inside were terrified but safe. They had survived another night. The attacks continued sporadically over the following weeks. The ridge hunters, having identified easy prey, kept returning. Each time the defenders fought them off, but the constant vigilance was exhausting. Something had to change. Isidore made a bold decision. He would hunt the pack leader. With it dead, the others would disperse to find new territory. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was the only way to secure lasting peace. Gerdane protested, but she saw the determination in his eyes and knew arguing would be futile. He tracked the pack to their den, a cave system in the Rocky Hills. He went alone, carrying his crossbow, knife, and spear. The confrontation was brutal and final. When he returned 3 days later, exhausted and wounded, but alive, he carried the pack leader's distinctive fangs as proof. The other ridge hunters had scattered, their hierarchy broken. The settlement noticed his absence and his return. Word spread of what he had done to protect not just his own family, but the refugee community he had taken in. Attitudes shifted further. Even some of Derek's former supporters began to see Isidore and his unconventional family in a new light. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The refugees, now stronger and more confident, began building their own homes near Isidore's cottage. A small community within the larger settlement, separate but no longer isolated. They traded goods and skills with the humans, proving their worth through action rather than words. Jolanella, now walking steadily and chattering constantly, played with human and alien children alike, a living symbol of the future they were building together. And Isidore, watching her laugh as she ran through the new grass, knew that every battle, every hardship, every moment of fear had been worth it for this, for the sound of children playing without seeing difference, only friendship.